Chapter 5 Dead God. Ghost in tears, O dead God, hollow eye, damp moustache, single tooth. O dead God, O dead God. Me, I pursued you with unfathomable hatred, and I would die of hatred as a cloud is undone. I am not a philosopher, but a saint, perhaps a madman. Bataille does not transmit a philosophy, but rather a delirious negative évangile. Death can be tasted. Monotheism has always preemptively reconstructed this message. You mean it can be known? Whatever else Bataille's method of meditation might be, it is also the violent contamination of Cartesianism. The title itself is compacted from Descartes' Discourse on Method and his Metaphysical Meditations, perhaps his principal texts. The reference is not incidental, since Descartes is a limit point of isolation, and in inner experience, Bataille implicitly discusses him in such terms. Descartes sought to know God, and to make use of this knowledge philosophically. In this way, a certain theological suppression of religion is consummated, with the philosopher sealing himself definitively within the prison of representation. Cartesian thinking understands itself ideologically in terms of a radical doubt, in reality wholly spurious, which is designed to serve it as an indisputable starting point for its intellectual productions, thus masking its neo-scholastic apologetic character. The corrosive force of doubt is to be preemptively exhausted in the initiation of the modern philosophical project, and thus mastered, ejected, by constructive reason without delay. What is in truth the extreme cowardice of Cartesian doubt, its undisturbed piety, is necessitated by its immediately theological character, since from the perspective of the Church, the slightest hint of radical interrogation is suspect. Such doubt merely replays the sham humility of Christian hope in the secular mode, rendering it epistemological, but maintaining its hypocritical and dogmatic character. Faith takes on the form of certainty in knowing, without ceasing to be inflexibly superstitious. The Cartesian ego, in its function as indubitable foundation, serves to equilibrate reason and existence, or rather, carries the inherited and uninterrogated certainty of this equilibrium forward into secular reason. This coherence of existent knowing has always been taken by philosophy to be the evident principle of ontology, or the harmonious reciprocity of knowing being. From Plato, through the scholastics, to Descartes, and beyond, thought presupposes and confirms existence, just as existence bears witness to its origin in divine ideation. Ontology can only be consummated by a being that is adequate to the highest forms of being, those that are insulated against the processes of corruption or degeneration that bring about a subsistence into non-being, so that it is finally in the divine image, which is, anyway, conveniently anthropoid, that the indestructible soul must be wrought. Only an immortal entity is able to reflectively apprehend pure being, without becoming inevitably lost in the swamp of matter, that dangerous compacted mass of being and annihilation, malignantly metamorphic, infectious, gnawed, and rotten with time. In keeping with the inherent tendency of all ontology, Descartes' ego is thus an extremity of separation, a capsule entity stripped of all relations other than those mediated by God, and moving only in strict succession from self, through the divine, to a weakly conceived alterity. It finds an immaculate relation to the profane world through representation, by means of which its being is reserved from the hazards of contact in the very exercise of knowing. It is in accord with such a doctrine that negation is purified of its raw materiality, and is thought as a function of representation, a logical operation, the denial of a thesis by and for a subject whose positivity is repeated indifferently throughout any series of intellectual affirmations or denials. It is in Descartes' philosophy that doubt is exhibited in its definitively profane sense, as despair transcended by the ego of ontological knowing. This profanation of oceanic despair, the opening of modernity in philosophy, does not subvert scholastic reasoning, but rather fulfills it, since it is the triumph of theology over religion. It is thus that in diagnosing the poverty of modern thinking, Bataille is not advocating any variety of squalid historical regression, because the only characteristic of scholastic philosophy worthy of affirmation is its ineffectiveness, rooted in a servile idiocy that has proven to be remarkably tenacious. Despair is not a motif of theology, but a lacuna within it. It is neither disbelief or doubt, both of which involve an ambivalence in the application of logical signs to an ontologically petrified thesis, but an unknowing so radical that it both escapes the scope of any possible epistemology and lacks all doctrinal intelligibility. Despair cannot be defined as a claim, hesitation, denial, or uncertainty. It is an abandonment and a plea without conceivable destination, a desertification resulting from the catastrophic disappearance of the value of being. Despair is not humble, but hubristic, and it is not pious in the least, but tragic. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche indicates that the issue at the core of the tragic is community. Despite the earliness of this text, written at a time when Nietzsche still adhered to a Wagnerian exaltation of the nation, the sense of community at work in it is only superficially commensurable with the thought of ethnic, political, or social unity. Tragic community is not the affirmation of a collective identity, but rather the dissolution of all identifiable traits in an uncircumscribable movement of catastrophe and festival. Catastrophe of the individuated self, festival of anonymous flow. Sacred communion, as opposed to mere empirical aggregation, cannot be politically restricted, since it does not proceed by means of a controllable process of assemblage, but by the blinding subsistence of autonomy. This takes the form of the sacrifice of the collectively invested individual, the tragic hero, the prince, God. Its emblem, therefore, is not the reverence of the masses for leader, homeland, culture, race, or creed, but regicide and eruption in the streets. From the first verse of John's Gospel to Hegel's The Science of Logic and beyond, Western history traverses a thanatological plateau. Man is the animal that knows it will die, determined in its essence by a knowledge whose specific mode is an immortalizing sublimation. In the massively preponderant aggregate, the Christian religion has preached not just the contingency of death, but its impossibility. God, for instance, insofar as he is shackled to his credibility, is unable to die, despite his melodramatically vaunted omnipotence. This is an infacility that is protracted through the angels. Humans are at least permitted a ludicrous pretense at termination. Christ, God pretending to be a man, pretending to die. But only the beasts are able to truly expire, perhaps because only they are left alone to do so. The death of God that Nietzsche outlines is not without a partial anticipation. If humanity's most morbid religion is initiated by an act of God, such an act is surely best described as a botched suicide attempt. It seems likely, as is so often the case, that this was a gesture, a plea for attention. The Judeo-Christian portrait of God is a classic sketch of pathological insecurity, how desperate he is to be loved, so insufficient to himself, and so alone. How sickening to live forever in this way, unable to even dream of escaping the smell of oneself. No one hates God as much as God. No one hates anything as much. It is not difficult to imagine his excitement attending the nihilistic ruin of his cult. The prospect of release at last, freed of all responsibility to serve as the principal of beings. His emergent superfluity must have welled up in him with the power of sexual crisis, such that it had all suddenly not been. There are times when one's pity for God becomes overwhelming. Nothing has ever had to bear a more ignoble existence than he. To not exist without excuse, as St. Anselm demonstrated, his very essence condemns him for this default. Could there be a more humiliating sinecure? When a replacement for God was sought, in the years 1888 to 9, even Nietzsche, that maniac of compassion, was reluctant to accept the post. The madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace, and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we plunging continuously? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continuously closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed. And whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent, and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. I have come too early, he said then. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars. And yet they have done it themselves. It has been related that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he is said to have replied nothing but, What, after all, are these churches now, if they are not tombs and sepulchres of God? God is nowhere to be found, yet there is still so much light, light that dazzles and maddens, crisp, ruthless light. Space echoes like an intense tomb, yet the stars still burn. Why does the sun take so long to die, or the moon retain such fidelity to the earth? Where is the new darkness, the greatest of all unknowings? Is death itself shy of us? The brilliance of God's non-being provokes a wave of cynical laughter. How strange that God's last act should be so entertaining. A good joke, but rather an old one now. It spawned innumerable witticisms that circulated in the marketplace. A final testament dissipated amongst the buzz of commodity exchange, but they faded fast. What was the death of God anyway? A slight fizz of exuberance in the stock market? A moderate lightening of the spirit? A relaxation? The end of a badly scripted play, greeted by the languid effervescence of cheap champagne? For a long time, there have been more important things to talk about in marketplaces. The things they save the expensive champagne for. Perhaps they laugh a little at God's demise occasionally, but they are bored by it. Even his taxidermists have deserted him. The best of them, at any rate. Those that remain are mostly the otherwise unemployable, the second-rate, the incompetent or unenthusiastic. So he deteriorates still, becoming more moth-eaten and absurd. If they laugh at all, it is because Yahweh has come to seem so much like a neglected teddy bear, balding, one arm hanging loose, an eye coming away. When they were children, stories about bears had frightened them. Not anymore. There was always something shoddy about this God, lost on the way to being and to us. Even lost for a little while on the way to death. A stumbler, an unwitting clown. Everything he does is botched, improvised, ostentatious. His past a mix of gaucherie and tantrum. Nowhere a hint of precocity, but always retardation, leaving abundant signs of a debilitating learning difficulty wherever he makes a mark. A slow child. Even the theologians admit to his simplicity. His diminishing flock rarely ask him about scientific matters anymore. Few of them dare ask themselves. He long ago dropped out of such classes, to the secret relief of his family. For a while they insisted that he had other gifts, ineffable ones, and, with the blindness of mothers, praised the aging infant's good nature, which they said had calmed down a lot. One can only smile. Maybe it is that we brought out the worst in him, for who could doubt God's fear of us? Was he not omniscient? Did he not always see the rusty dagger in our hands? And we were created in his image, the corporealization of his hatred for himself. What tatters of self-love remained to him came apart at this sight, to reign over all things as the archetype of man, a piteous enough truth to exhibit. Few things approximate so closely to infinity as the humorous incommensurability between man and the sum of the universe. To span such a gulf within oneself is to live in idiocy. To be not only an animal, but a depraved one, an aborted animal, a sick animal, a delirious animal. Upon first seeing a rabid dog, one thinks that it is becoming human. This is not a promising basis for divinity. If he hid from us, it was only in attempting to hide his eyes, to block us out. Yet amongst the accidents of his omniscience, or of his inexistence, was included the absence of eyelids. We burnt on his sleep-starved retina like harsh stars. Our deicide crawled like a rash upon his skin. He could only stare at us, and our history ensued, a convulsion of lethal horror. Of course, he made innumerable attempts at emigration, but who would have him? Who wants a second-hand God? Philosophy provided only a temporary refuge, rebelling eventually against his bad manners. How nostalgic he was of his days as a carpenter, once he had become a tramp. It is tempting to dredge into our lassitude, seeking another end for God. Might he not have been allowed to retire? The state would surely have granted him a modest pension. Does not Kant provide the basis for such a policy? After all, few would dispute that senile tyrants make wretched victims. It seems scarcely more dignified to kill God than to slaughter a dog when it becomes too old to work. Who then is still capable of Nietzsche's generosity? It is rare to find one who takes much pride in slaughtering God these days. More common is a vague feeling of impurity. One has soiled oneself by bothering with something so vile and corrupt. That God was ever permitted residence amongst us is a source of embarrassment, or at best of uneasy humor. It is understandable that many should feel vaguely bad about God. Was he not a little too vulnerable, old, and pitiful to kill? Should we not greet his inexistence with an impatient "of course," and turn to more serious things? Do we really lack the delicacy to let God die quietly, on his own, like a dog? It is true that we probably merited a better God to sacrifice. It is not unreasonable to imagine that a cosmos that spawned a Heraclitus deserved a more dignified ruler than the grumpy old ape of Occidental monotheism. Nevertheless, it is pointless nursing such regrets. They belong to the mournful might-have-beens of our history, decided long before we had a chance to shop around for a god. Bataille ends an early article entitled Propositions with the words, "The true universality is the death of God." He is insistent throughout the entire sweep of his work that the death of God, as announced in Nietzsche's The Gay Science, is to be thought of as a religious event, indeed as the positive end of religion, as zero. For Bataille, far more than for Nietzsche, the atheology thus engendered is of a specifically Christian character, in that it is rooted in the sense of the crucifixion. Bataille reads the world historical power of Christianity through its quasi-latent content of an absolute sacrifice, that of God himself, which has created a religion of divine suicide. At the same time, he considers Christianity to have deformed and obscured this thought, burying it under a theology of redemption. In the development of monotheistic belief, man tends to substitute for the evident prodigality of the heavens the avidity which constitutes him. It is thus that little by little he effaces the image of celestial reality without sense or pretension and replaces it with a personification of an anthropomorphic nature, of the immutable idea of good. The subordination of the sacred category of death to the rational category of immortality, perdurant value, is a profanation of religion, the transformation of sacrifice into utility, exchange, and negotiation. A god unable to expend itself utterly is a figure of servility and abjection, bound to persistence with iron chains. God, the transcendent guarantee of being, a service of God's abasement before this principle, that being persist, be imperishable. Bataille insists that Nietzsche's thought of the death of God is sacrificial, orgiastic, and festive. Christian belief must pass over not into a complacent scientistic utilitarianism, but into the ecstasies of uninhibited wastage. The loss of God is the loss of self, the definitive shattering of the anthropic image, so that the perdurant ego of servile humanity is dissolved into the solar energy flow. Bataille is not remotely interested in being saved. He wants only to touch the extreme, writing that, "I have wanted and found ecstasy, an ecstasy that is the experienced loss of being. This is not a matter of dying, but of surviving, momentarily, only through excess, as chance, without guarantees, and without inhibiting the dissipative tide. Being is given to us in an intolerable surpassing of being, no less intolerable than death, and because, in death, this is withdrawn from us at the same time it is given, we must search for it in the feeling of death, in those intolerable moments where it seems that we are dying, because the being in us is only there through excess, when the plenitude of horror and that of joy coincide." God has only one possible meaning: phallus. The God of the ontological argument is omniphallus, in whom reason, being, authority, and the good coincide. It belongs to the essence of a perfect being that he exist forever. Who could deny that the crucified was well hung? But perhaps one should not laugh about such things, for even if God is a comic, one's Willie, and its mythology, has surely to be taken seriously. As for Yahweh's immense throbbing member, that is a matter of the gravest consequence. Through it he establishes himself as the supreme transcendent object, eternally postponing the black spasm, whose result is detumescence and the end of the universe. Were God to ever sacrifice his erection for a taste of death, the principle of identity would dissipate into scorched dust, and being would relapse into the dark. phallus, as psychoanalysis has always said, is the same as castration. To be an immortal organ of intimidation is to abstain forever from the movement twisted through oblivion and relapse. In the Solaranus, Bataille remarks, those in whom the force of eruption is accumulated are necessarily situated below, en bas. What God must never succumb to is the molten penis of terrestrial coupling, for which logic, of castration, has lost its sense, because nothing remains to separate it from vulvic dissolution. In the final spasm of sexual anguish, God bites off his penis, and, with his maw dripping blood, mules like a dying hyena into the void. "Would you see my rags?" she said. With both hands gripping the table, I turned towards her. Seated, she lifted a leg high. In order to better open the slit, she drew apart the skin with both hands. Thus the rags of Edwarda gazed at me, hairy and pink, full of life like a repugnant octopus. I stammered softly, "Why do you do that?" "You see," she said, "I am God." The narrator of Madame Edwarda proceeds to kiss the whore's rags as the Christian mystics kiss the wounds of Christ. There can be little doubt that Bataille imagines the vulva as a wound, but this is not because of a negative relation to castration. Far from being an excised penis, the vulva is a complex terrain of contact with death, of exactly the kind castration proscribes. Nor can the flowing wound that breaks open being into communication be one pole of a sexual relation, matched by a plenitude, since this vulvic opening would be sexuality itself, except there is no such thing as sexuality itself. The ancient Romans are only the most famous example of the arithmetical gratuitousness of zero. When zero is absent, it is not missed. No one notices the default of default. Nevertheless, counting systems, enriched by zero, and the place order associated with it, are of massively enhanced sophistication over those in which nothing is missing. Introducing nothing makes an inestimable difference. Zero is indivisible, so that zero belief cannot be rigorously differentiated from belief in zero. It is in this sense that atheism is a religion. Not that atheism is committed to a specific conviction, quite the opposite. It is precisely the specificity of conviction that it attacks. Understood negatively, it denies the false absolute of theos. But understood positively, it affirms the true absolute marked by the privative a, the nihil from which creation proceeds, the undifferentiable cosmic zero. When the valet touched the slit, he groaned, "In the name of God!" I drink in your rending, and I spread your naked legs. I open them like a book, where I read that which kills me. I am God.
I am God.
I knock on your head, Herr Priest. I kill you. I am a cunt. Bataille. Everything has obviously gone wrong for us in order for Plato to begin with 1 rather than 0. To take 1 as originary is to presuppose everything, such as unity, individuation, achieved form, and dogmatic plenitude. The 1 is the phallomorphic base of Occidental culture, in the sense that Irigaray understands it. It is the mono of monotheism, and monotheism is condensed irreligion, the definitive patriarchal effacing of intrauterine indifferentiation. and thus of the primary ripple from out of chaotic zero. The differentiated one is the Father, and his adorers understand nothing of religion, even in writing the nothing, as Aquinas does. They eclipse it with absolute ego, him. Nor is it the case that primary immanence is merely crushed with arbitrariness beneath a partially inadequate metaphorics, since, far from being neutral between the sexes, it is precisely because indifferentiation equals zero is sexually unsegmented that it is even more feminine than the mother. The femininity of zero is uncompromised by its indifference, due to the unilateral character of individualizing deviation. Whilst zero is certainly alien to the Father, there is no differentiation from zero. Indeed, zero is so utterly vulvo-uterine that patriarchy is synonymous with irreligion, faith. Between barter systems and money systems, there is a difference strictly analogous to that between Roman arithmetics and the place value system from India, transmitted by the Arabs to the West. Like zero, money is a redundant operator, adding nothing in order to make things hum. When Marx associates capital with death, he is only drawing the final consequence from this correspondence. Surplus value comes out of labor power, but surplus production comes out of nothing. This is why capital production is the consummating phase of nihilism, the liquidation of theological irreligion, the twilight of the idols. Modernity is virtual thanocracy, guided insidiously by zero, the epoch of the death of God. There is no God, but only zero. Indifferentiation without unity. And nihil is true religion. Schopenhauer remarks of the cosmic vulva equals zero. We must not even evade it, as the Indians do, by myths and meaningless words, such as reabsorption in Brahman or the nirvana of the Buddhists. On the contrary, we freely acknowledge that what remains after the complete abolition of the will is, for all who are still full of the will, assuredly nothing. But also, conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, this very real world, with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing.